The biting Colorado wind howled a mournful tune, carrying with it the last whispers of a fading life. Thomas Crawford, a man forged by the untamed West, clutched his wife's hand, utterly powerless against the fever that stole her breath. But even as one love departed, a desperate promise paved the way for another. A story of unexpected resilience and a heart's capacity to heal, forever etched into the unforgiving frontier. The chilling death knell of fever echoed through Jedediah Stone's small cabin, each rattle a torment as he desperately clutched his wife's hand. He watched, helpless and heartbroken, as her vibrant life slowly, agonizingly, slipped away amidst the brutal Colorado winter of 1878. Elara Stone, once a beacon of laughter and boundless energy, was now a fragile shadow of her former self. Her beautiful auburn hair lay matted with sweat, and her bright emerald eyes were glazed over with the terrifying haze of delirium. The gruff mountain doctor, a man who had seen too much sorrow, had tried every known remedy. He'd brewed potent willowbark tea, applied cold compresses to her burning forehead, and even used the last precious drops of Jedediah's whiskey, hoping against hope to break the fever's grip. But the virulent influenza, a silent reaper that had swept mercilessly through Pinecrest Valley, had claimed its most cherished victim yet. "Promise me, Jedediah," Elara whispered, her voice a mere fragile wisp, barely audible above the relentless howling wind outside their small, isolated homestead. "Promise me you'll write to Clara. She'll come. She always said she would." Jedediah, his vision blurred by unshed tears, nodded. His weathered face was a roadmap of sorrow, each line deepened by the profound grief that gripped him. At 32, he was a man who had faced down ruthless outlaws, miraculously survived a brutal Comanche raid, and stoically endured 3 grueling years of drought on his land. Yet, absolutely nothing in his tough life had prepared him for the utter devastation of losing Elara, his beloved wife of 8 cherished years. "I promise, Ellie," he choked out, his voice raw with emotion. He pressed her delicate, feverish fingers to his trembling lips, a desperate attempt to hold on to the last vestiges of her warmth. "I'll write to your sister." Elara's final breath came quietly, subtly, like the soft, silent settling of fresh snow on the windowsill outside their window. Jedediah remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, for hours, still tenderly holding her hand as its warmth slowly ebbed away, leaving only cold, unresponsive flesh. Outside, the persistent demands of frontier life continued. The livestock needed urgent tending, the dwindling fire in the hearth needed stoking to ward off the biting cold. But the big cowboy, a man usually driven by an unyielding sense of duty, simply couldn't move. His entire world, the solid, dependable foundation he had built, had utterly collapsed around him. It left behind nothing but the hollow, echoing shell of the cabin they had meticulously built together, now a monument to his profound loss. The funeral, held just days later, was a small, somber affair, yet it was conducted with the quiet dignity that the tight-knit community of Pinecrest afforded its own. All 23 residents of the valley attended, their faces grim and solemn in the bitter January cold, as the preacher spoke words that Jedediah barely registered, lost in his fog of grief. He nodded mechanically when people offered their heartfelt condolences, accepted the endless covered dishes that he knew he would never touch, let alone eat. Then, like a ghost, he returned to his now empty cabin, the silence suffocating, to write the hardest, most gut-wrenching letter of his entire life. "Dear Miss Clara Beaumont," he began, his large calloused hand trembling almost uncontrollably as he dipped the pen into the inkwell once more. "It is with profound sorrow that I must inform you of the passing of your beloved sister, Elara. The insidious influenza took her from us 3 days past. In her final fading moments, she specifically asked that I write to you." Jedediah paused, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. What could he possibly say that truly captured the depth of his failure to protect her? How could he explain that the remote, challenging mountain life he had so proudly promised would be filled with grand adventures had, in the cruelest twist of fate, ultimately claimed her life? He finished the heart-wrenching letter with only the most practical, sterile details. The exact date of her passing, the precise location of their remote homestead, should Clara ever wish to visit Elara's lonely grave. He sealed the envelope with a heavy heart, unable to bear rereading the raw, emotional words he had just penned. The letter, he knew, would take weeks, perhaps even months, to finally reach Boston, the bustling city where Elara had often told him Clara taught at a prestigious ladies' finishing school. Jedediah had never actually met his sister-in-law. His knowledge of her was solely through Elara's frequent, affectionate stories. Clara was the younger sister who had selflessly raised Elara after the tragic, untimely death of their parents. She was the one who had sacrificed her own burgeoning opportunities, her own dreams, so that Elara could embrace love, marry, and embark on a new life moving west with the man she adored. Winter, with its relentless grip, slowly but surely gave way to the gentle, hopeful promise of spring. Jedediah moved through his days like a ghost, a mere automaton. He dutifully tended the livestock, repaired the dilapidated fences, and offered grim, terse nods to the sympathetic neighbors who still looked at him with profound pity in their eyes. At night, when the chores were done and the world grew quiet, he would sit alone on the creaky porch, staring up at the countless stars that Elara had so dearly loved. He'd drink just enough harsh whiskey to numb the agonizing pain that gnawed at his soul, but never quite enough to truly forget his responsibilities, never enough to escape the memories that haunted him. It was early May when the stagecoach, a rare and exciting sight, rumbled into Pinecrest. Its arrival was an unusual occurrence, as the route typically only came through the remote valley every other month. Jedediah was in town, purchasing much-needed supplies at the general store, when he noticed the sudden commotion, the unusual gathering of curious onlookers. "Stone!" Samuel Miller, the elderly, grizzled storekeeper, called out, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the day. "There's someone here asking after you." Jedediah turned slowly, his heart catching painfully in his throat at the sight of the woman standing elegantly on the porch of the general store. For one impossible, fleeting moment, he thought, with a desperate surge of hope, that Elara had somehow, miraculously, returned to him. The same striking auburn hair, the similar delicate features that had captivated him years ago. But as he drew closer, the subtle yet distinct differences became undeniably apparent. This woman was slightly taller, her posture noticeably more rigid, almost regal. Her eyes, though a similar shade of green, were a deeper, more intense emerald than Elara's bright cornflower gaze. She wore a simple yet impeccably tailored traveling dress of deep navy blue. It was practical, yes, but unmistakably Eastern in its refined cut and superior quality. "Mr. Stone?" she inquired, her voice crisp and clear, yet betraying a hint of hesitation. "I'm Clara Beaumont, Elara's sister." Jedediah, suddenly acutely aware of his own unkempt appearance, the beard he'd neglected to trim for weeks, the faded, worn shirt that had certainly seen better days, removed his dusty hat. "Miss Beaumont," he managed, his voice a little hoarse, "I wasn't expecting you." "I received your letter," she stated simply, her deep green eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel surprisingly uncomfortable, as if she could see directly into his soul. "I've come to pay my respects to my sister, and—" She hesitated, her gaze briefly sweeping over the curious, openly staring onlookers. "Perhaps we could speak privately." Jedediah nodded, grateful for the escape from prying eyes. He quickly helped the stagecoach driver unload her meticulously packed trunk and a practical carpet bag. "My wagon's just over yonder," he gestured vaguely. "It's about 5 miles to the homestead." The ride back to the secluded homestead was impossibly awkward, filled with the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that stretches uncomfortably between two strangers, now inextricably bound by a profound shared loss. Jedediah stole furtive glances at Clara, noting how she sat ramrod straight despite the jarring jolts and bumps of the wagon. Her gloved hands remained neatly folded in her lap, a picture of contained composure. "Elara wrote to me often about this place," Clara finally said, her voice soft as they crested a hill, revealing the breathtaking, sprawling valley below them, bathed in the soft afternoon light. "She said the wildflowers in spring were worth every single hardship of winter." Jedediah's throat tightened painfully. "They were her favorite," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Valleys full of them now." Clara nodded, and Jedediah caught the faint, telltale glimmer of tears that she quickly, almost imperceptibly, blinked away. This woman, this seemingly proper, refined Eastern lady, suddenly seemed far more real, more vulnerable to him. "She loved it here," he offered quietly, a deep truth in his words. "Even when things were hard, she never complained, not once." "That sounds exactly like Ellie," Clara replied, a sad, poignant smile gracing her lips. "She always found beauty everywhere she looked." As they approached the homestead, Jedediah felt a complex flush of pride warring with a deep sense of shame. The cabin itself was undeniably solid and incredibly well built, a testament to his hard work. He had even completed a new addition just last summer, a larger kitchen Elara had always dreamed of. But the vibrant flower beds she had tended so lovingly were now sadly overgrown with relentless weeds, and the pretty curtains she had meticulously sewn hung limp and dusty in the windows, silent reminders of her absence. "It's not much," he said apologetically, his voice heavy as he helped Clara carefully descend from the wagon. "But it's home." "It's exactly as she described," Clara replied, her perceptive eyes taking in every single detail, missing nothing. "She was very proud of what you built together." Inside, Jedediah was painfully, acutely aware of the sorry bachelor state to which the cabin had regrettably descended since Elara's passing. He'd kept it functional, yes, but little more than that. Dishes were stacked haphazardly in the sink, clothes were carelessly draped over chairs, and Elara's cherished collection of pressed wildflowers was sadly gathering dust on the mantel. Another forgotten memory. "I'll put your things in the spare room," Jedediah said hastily, awkwardly, grabbing her trunk before she could react. "It's not much, but there's a bed and—" "Mr. Stone," Clara interrupted gently, her voice calm and reassuring. "Please don't trouble yourself on my account. I understand what grief can do to a household." There was something in her voice, a profound depth of understanding that went far beyond mere polite words, that made Jedediah pause, truly listen. "You're very kind, Miss Beaumont," he said, sincerity thick in his voice. "More than I deserve." Clara removed her gloves and hat, setting them aside with deliberate, almost ritualistic care. "I'm not here to judge, Mr. Stone. I'm here because Elara was the only family I had left in this world, and because—" She hesitated, carefully choosing her next words. She asked me to come, should anything happen to her. Jedediah frowned, confused. In her letters to you? He questioned. Clara nodded. Yes. She worried about this place being too remote, about what would happen if exactly what did happen, happened. She took a deep, fortifying breath. She asked me to promise that I would come and help, should she... Her voice faltered, unable to complete the painful sentence. She never told me that, Jedediah said softly, his heart aching anew. She wouldn't have wanted to worry you, Clara replied, her gaze direct and unflinching. But I promised her, and I keep my promises, Mr. Stone. Jedediah, he corrected her automatically, almost without thinking. Please call me Jedediah. Jedediah, she repeated, and he was struck by how utterly different his name sounded when spoken by her, compared to the sweet, lilting way Elara had always said it. I have taken a leave of absence from the school where I teach. I can stay for 3 months. To help put things in order, to visit Ellie's grave, and to... She gestured vaguely around the now tidied cabin, a subtle acknowledgement of her quiet work. To ensure that you're managing. Jedediah should have been offended by the subtle implication that he needed managing, but instead, he felt a wave of profound relief wash over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. For months, he'd been slowly drowning in the crushing weight of grief and the relentless responsibilities of the homestead. And now this woman, this stranger, who was also inexplicably familiar, was offering him a lifeline, a glimmer of hope. I'd be grateful for the help, Miss Beaumont, he said sincerely, his voice husky with emotion. And I think Elara would be too. Clara's smile was small, a faint, almost imperceptible curving of her lips, but it was undeniably genuine. Then it settled, she said, her voice firm. And please call me Clara. That very first evening established a pattern, a quiet rhythm that would continue steadfastly in the weeks to come. Clara, once given a quick tour of the cabin, immediately, almost instinctively, set to work, bringing a much-needed sense of order to the pervasive chaos. She didn't criticize, didn't comment on the dismal state of things. She simply, with a quiet determination, rolled up her sleeves, quite literally, Jedediah noted with a flicker of surprise, and began the arduous task of sorting, cleaning, and organizing. Jedediah, uncertain of his exact role with this new, quietly powerful presence in his home, retreated to the familiar solace of the barn. There, he tended to the livestock and diligently completed the endless, back-breaking chores that kept the isolated homestead functioning, a constant physical distraction from his inner turmoil. When he returned for supper that evening, he was utterly astonished to find the rough-hewn table meticulously set, the cabin filled with the comforting warm aroma of freshly baked bread and a hearty stew bubbling invitingly on the stove. The scent alone made his stomach growl in a way it hadn't in months, a forgotten sensation of hunger. You didn't have to cook, he said awkwardly, standing in the doorway, his dusty hat still clutched in his hands. I enjoy cooking, Clara replied simply, her voice calm and even. Elara wrote that you're partial to venison stew. I found some in your smokehouse. Jedediah swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. The venison, he remembered with a pang, had been from his very last hunt with Elara. She had helped him track the buck, her eyes bright with excitement, and had even insisted on learning to smoke the meat herself, a testament to her adventurous spirit. He hadn't been able to bring himself to touch it since her passing, the memory too painful. That's thoughtful of you, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. They ate in relative silence, a quiet meal, but it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Jedediah found himself stealing furtive glances at Clara, subtly noting the differences between her and Elara. Where his late wife had been soft and warm, a comforting presence, Clara was contained, precise, almost regal in her movements. Her gestures were economical, her posture perfect, even at their rough, hand-hewn table. Yet, there were fleeting moments. A certain tilt of her head, the unconscious way she absently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, that were so eerily reminiscent of Ilara that it made his heart ache with a familiar bittersweet pang. "Would you show me her grave tomorrow?" Clara asked suddenly, breaking the quiet, setting down her spoon with a soft clink. Jedediah nodded, grateful for the direct question that pulled him from his reverie. "Of course. It's not far, just up on that rise to the east. She always said it had the best view of the valley." "She would have appreciated that," Clara said softly, a poignant truth in her words. Then, abruptly changing the subject, her practical nature reasserting itself. "I noticed your vegetable garden needs attention. Ilara wrote that you grow most of your own food." "We did," Jedediah confirmed, his voice laced with a lingering sadness. "I haven't had the heart to plant much this spring." "Then we'll start there tomorrow, after visiting Ellie," Clara said decisively, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's not too late to get a good summer crop in." Jedediah wanted to protest, to explain the deep-seated aversion he felt towards performing tasks he had always shared with Ilara. But something in Clara's steady, unwavering gaze stopped him. This wasn't about sentimentality, it was about the harsh, unyielding practicality of frontier survival. If they didn't plant now, there would be no food for winter, a stark reality. Ilara, he knew, would have been the first to say so, her practical spirit overriding any emotional qualms. "All right," he agreed, the words feeling surprisingly easy as they left his lips. "We'll plant tomorrow." The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect late spring day, vibrant and alive in the majestic mountains. Jedediah led Clara up the gentle, sun-dappled slope to where a simple, weathered wooden cross marked Ilara's peaceful grave. He'd chosen the spot with immense care, a small, secluded clearing nestled among graceful aspen trees, overlooking the vast, breathtaking expanse of the valley and their small cabin below. Wildflowers, in a joyous explosion of color, were already beginning to bloom all around, painting the hillside in vibrant splashes of blue, yellow, and royal purple. Jedediah hung back, giving Clara her space as she approached the grave. She knelt beside it, a figure of quiet reverence, removed a small leather-bound book from her pocket, and began to read aloud in a clear, steady voice that carried gently on the soft breeze. It took Jedediah a moment to recognize the familiar poem, one Ilara had often recited, a comforting verse about death being merely a doorway, a gentle transition to another room. The poignant words, spoken in Clara's voice, brought fresh, unbidden tears to his eyes, a release he hadn't known he needed. When she finished reading, Clara remained kneeling for several minutes, her head bowed in silent communion. Jedediah, respecting her profound grief, turned away, granting her the sacred privacy she deserved in that moment. When she finally rose and rejoined him, her eyes were unmistakably red-rimmed, but remarkably, perfectly dry. She loved poetry, Clara said simply, her voice a soft murmur. "Our mother taught us both to recite verse before we could properly read. She would recite poems while she worked," Jedediah remembered, a faint, nostalgic smile touching his lips. "Said it made the time pass quicker." Clara nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. She was always the one finding ways to make difficult things bearable. She looked back at the simple grave, then straightened her shoulders with a renewed sense of purpose. "She would want us to get on with things, wouldn't she?" "She would," Jedediah agreed, finding unexpected comfort in this shared understanding of the woman they had both loved, albeit in profoundly different ways. They spent the remainder of the day together, preparing and diligently planting the vegetable garden. Jedediah was genuinely surprised to discover that, despite her refined, seemingly delicate appearance, Clara was no stranger to the demands of physical labor. She worked methodically, efficiently, digging neat furrows and planting seeds with practiced, almost innate precision. "Elara wrote that you were a school teacher," Jedediah remarked, curious, as they worked tirelessly side by side, their movements synchronized. "I didn't expect you to know farming." Clara smiled faintly, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Before I taught at the finishing school, I worked at a rural school in Vermont. Many of my students were farm children. I learned alongside them in their family gardens, so I could better understand their lives." She paused, pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, a practical, unladylike gesture. "Besides, Elara and I grew up on a small farm outside Boston until our parents died. I've always kept a kitchen garden, even in the city." Jedediah nodded, genuinely impressed despite himself. "Elara never mentioned that." "She was very young when we lost our parents," Clara explained softly. "I was 12, she was only 7. She probably didn't remember much of the farm life." As the days slowly transitioned into weeks, Jedediah and Clara settled into an unexpected yet comforting rhythm. During the daylight hours, they worked separately, but with a common purpose. Jedediah diligently tended to the demanding livestock and tirelessly repaired the fences and outbuildings that had suffered from months of neglect during his profound grief. Meanwhile, Clara, with her quiet efficiency, brought the household back to order and meticulously maintained the thriving garden. In the evenings, they would share a simple meal and increasingly engage in quiet, meaningful conversation. Jedediah learned that Clara was 28, 4 years younger than Elara would have been. She had never married, choosing instead to devote herself entirely to her teaching career, and more importantly, to supporting Elara after the tragic death of their parents. She was remarkably well-read, possessing a sharp intellect, and had strong opinions on everything from the complex world of politics to the beauty of literature. However, she expressed these opinions with a careful restraint, a subtle deference that made it clear she was accustomed to keeping her thoughts, her true feelings, to herself. For her part, Clara gradually, gently, drew Jedediah out of his self-imposed shell of grief. She encouraged him to speak of Elara, not just in terms of her devastating death, but of their vibrant life together. She listened attentively, with genuine empathy, as he recounted their adventurous journey west, the myriad challenges of building their beloved homestead from the ground up, and the shared dreams they had harbored for its future, dreams now tragically unfulfilled. "She wrote to me about the apple orchard you plan to plant," Clara mentioned one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the glorious sunset paint the vast valley in breathtaking shades of gold and royal purple. Jedediah nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. "We had the saplings ordered. They arrived 2 weeks after she died. I couldn't—" He shook his head, unable to complete the painful thought. "They're still in the root cellar, wrapped in burlap, probably dead by now." "Perhaps not," Clara said thoughtfully, her voice gentle but hopeful. "Saplings can be remarkably resilient if properly stored. We could check them tomorrow." To Jedediah's utter astonishment, 5 of the 10 apple saplings had miraculously survived, their roots still moist and tender, young shoots showing vibrant green when he carefully unwrapped them. Under Clara's calm, practical direction, they planted them in the very spot Elara had chosen, a sunny slope not far from the cabin, a silent testament to enduring hope. "She'll never see them bear fruit," Jedediah said heavily, his voice laden with sadness as they tamped soil around the last sapling. "No," Clara agreed quietly, her eyes meeting his directly. "But someone will." Life continues, Jedediah. Elara understood that better than most. As May gracefully transitioned into June, the rhythms of the homestead, once so disrupted by grief, began to feel almost normal again. The vegetable garden, under Clara's meticulous care, flourished with an abundance of life. The newly planted apple saplings took tentative root, promising future harvests. Jedediah found himself awakening each morning with a renewed sense of purpose, rather than the crushing weight of dread that had plagued him for months. The quiet, steady presence of Elara's sister was both a constant, poignant reminder of his profound loss and, paradoxically, a soothing balm for it. Clara, too, seemed to be settling into this wild, untamed land. The rigid posture and formal manners that had so distinctly marked her arrival gradually softened, shedding their stiff Eastern shell. She began to wear simpler, more practical dresses, often with her sleeves comfortably rolled up and her hair tied back with a utilitarian ribbon, rather than meticulously pinned in its former formal style. Jedediah occasionally caught her humming softly as she worked, the same familiar folk tunes Elara had so dearly loved. And sometimes, to his delight, she would even laugh, a genuine, unrestrained sound, at the playful antics of the barn cats or the stubborn, opinionated old rooster that proudly ruled the henhouse. It was Clara who gently suggested they attend the midsummer social in Pinecrest, reasoning with her characteristic practicality that Jedediah had been isolated for far too long, dwelling in his own sorrow. He resisted initially, unable to fathom engaging in festivities when Elara was gone. The very thought felt like a betrayal, but Clara was gently insistent, her quiet persistence undeniable. "The community has been kind to you," she reminded him, her voice soft but firm, "and Elara would want you to maintain those connections, to not disappear from life." So it was that Jedediah found himself driving the sturdy wagon into town on a warm June evening, with Clara gracefully seated beside him. She wore her best dress, a simple yet elegant blue cotton that beautifully brought out the striking color of her eyes. He was acutely aware of how their situation might appear to others, a widower bringing his late wife's sister to a social gathering barely 5 months after his wife's tragic death. But Clara's calm, unwavering presence somehow made it easier to face the inevitable whispers, the curious, speculative glances. The social gathering was held in the newly constructed schoolhouse, a sturdy, welcoming building beautifully decorated with freshly picked wildflowers and romantically lit with glowing lanterns. Most of Pinecrest's residents were in joyous attendance, along with folks from neighboring homesteads who had traveled for the occasion. Jedediah braced himself for awkwardness, for the uncomfortable questions, but to his surprise, people seemed genuinely pleased to see him, to witness his slow, tentative emergence from his prolonged isolation. Several of the women immediately drew Clara into warm conversation, their faces alight with interest, while the men clapped Jedediah heartily on the shoulder, offering quiet words of approval for his return to community life. "You've got yourself a good helper there, Jedediah," observed Silas Miller, whose expansive farm bordered Jedediah's property. "Miss Beaumont's got quite a way with those vegetables of yours. Saw them when I rode past last week. Finest-looking garden in the whole county." "She's been a godsend," Jedediah admitted, his gaze drifting across the room to where Clara chatted animatedly with Silas's wife. "Don't know what I'd have done without her help these past weeks." Silas gave him a shrewd, knowing look, his eyes twinkling. "She planning to stay on?" The direct question caught Jedediah completely off guard. He'd been so intensely focused on the day-to-day survival that he hadn't allowed himself to think about Clara's eventual, inevitable departure. "She took a 3-month leave from her teaching position," he said slowly, the words heavy with unspoken implications. She's due to return to Boston in August. Silas nodded thoughtfully, a hint of regret in his expression. Shame. Seems to me she fits in here just fine. Before Jedediah could formulate a response, the fiddler struck up a lively foot-tapping tune, and people began eagerly clearing space for dancing. Jedediah retreated to the edge of the room, content, or so he told himself, to merely observe. But after several spirited dances, he was surprised to see Clara approaching him, her cheeks flushed with a healthy exertion, a bright sparkle in her emerald eyes. "Mrs. Miller tells me you're quite the dancer, Mr. Stone," she said, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischievous amusement. "She says Alara always boasted that you never missed a chance to show off your footwork." Jedediah felt a blush creep up his weathered face. "Alara exaggerated my abilities," he demurred, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Well, I've just promised the next dance to young Mr. Wilson's son," she replied, her voice light and teasing. "But perhaps after that, you might prove whether my sister was exaggerating or not." Clara's tone was playful, but Jedediah detected something else beneath it, a gentle challenge perhaps, or an unspoken invitation to step further out of the suffocating shadow of his grief. Before he could formulate a response, Clara was gracefully swept away by young Wilson, leaving Jedediah to ponder this new, intriguing development. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself any pleasure, any joy, that the very idea of dancing felt almost like a betrayal of Alara's memory. Yet as he watched Clara move gracefully through the intricate figures of the dance, he found himself remembering Alara's vibrant love of such gatherings, how she would insist they attend every social event within riding distance, her laughter echoing through the night. When the dance ended and Clara returned to his side, slightly breathless and smiling, Jedediah made his decision, a quiet resolve settling over him. "I believe you requested proof of my dancing skills, Miss Beaumont," he said, offering her his arm with a formality that made her laugh, a bright, unrestrained sound that warmed him. "Indeed I did, Mr. Stone," she replied, her eyes sparkling, taking his offered arm with a delicate touch. The fiddles then struck up a waltz, a slower, more intimate dance than the lively reels and boisterous square dances that had preceded it. Jedediah hesitated for just a moment before placing his hand properly, respectfully, at Clara's waist. It had been so long since he'd touched a woman, even in such a formal, appropriate way, that the contact felt startlingly intimate, sending a jolt through him. Clara must have sensed his momentary discomfort, for she met his eyes with a steady, reassuring gaze. "It's just a dance, Jedediah," she said quietly, her voice a gentle balm. "We're honoring life, not disrespecting death." Her profound words, so simple yet so powerful, freed something deep within him. As they began to move together, gliding gracefully across the packed earth, Jedediah found himself remembering the sheer, unadulterated joy that had once been such an integral part of his life with Alara. Clara was a different partner, more precise in her movements, less exuberant than Alara had been. But there was an undeniable grace to her, a quiet elegance that made leading her through the waltz surprisingly pleasant, almost effortless. As the music swelled around them, Jedediah became acutely aware of approving glances from the townspeople gathered around them. Mrs. Miller nodded with a knowing smile, and even the stern preacher's wife offered a small, encouraging smile. These kind people had watched him struggle through the darkest, most agonizing months of his life, bearing witness to his profound grief. Now they were witnessing his first tentative, hopeful steps back toward living it, a silent cheer for his resilience. The dance ended far too soon, and Jedediah reluctantly released Clara's waist, the warmth of her presence lingering. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice a little hoarse with emotion. "The pleasure was mine," she replied, and the genuine warmth in her smile stirred something in Jedediah that he had thought long buried, irrevocably lost with Elara. The ride home was companionable, filled with a newfound ease. Clara recounted with a delightful wit conversations she'd had with various townspeople, her observations sharp and amusing. Jedediah, in turn, pointed out familiar constellations in the clear, vast night sky, their conversation flowing naturally. It was the most normal Jedediah had felt since Elara's devastating death, just a man and a woman, enjoying a pleasant evening after a social gathering, the simple beauty of it washing over him. Yet, as they neared the homestead, Jedediah found himself troubled by Silas Miller's earlier question, a nagging worry that had taken root in his mind. Clara would be leaving in August. The thought sent an unexpected, sharp pang through him. In just a few short weeks, she had become an essential, undeniable part of the homestead, and he had to admit, a vital part of his life. What would happen when she returned to Boston, to her respectable life? How would he manage the thriving garden she'd so diligently planted, the orderly household she'd so painstakingly restored, the comforting daily rhythms she'd so carefully re-established? "You're very quiet," Clara observed, her voice gentle as they approached the cabin, bathed in the soft moonlight. "Just thinking," Jedediah replied, helping her gracefully down from the wagon. "Silas Miller asked how long you'll be staying." "Ah," Clara said, her expression unreadable in the silver moonlight. "I suppose that is a practical question. My leave from the school ends in mid-August." Jedediah nodded, busying himself with unhitching the horses, a convenient excuse to avoid meeting her steady gaze. "The place will seem awfully quiet when you go." Clara was silent for a long moment, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the night breeze. "I've grown quite fond of it here," she finally said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "More than I expected to." There was something in her voice, a subtle vulnerability, that made Jedediah look up. She was standing in the moonlight, her face tilted gently toward the cabin, an expression of genuine affection softening her features. "It suits you," he said without thinking, the words a spontaneous truth. "More than I would have expected." She turned to him with a small, wistful smile. "Elara always said I was too formal, too rigid for frontier life." She paused, her eyes sparkling with a renewed sense of connection. "I think she would be surprised to see how comfortable I've become here." "I think she'd be pleased," Jedediah said honestly, a warmth spreading through him. "She always wanted you to visit, said you worked too hard and needed mountain air to cure your city pallor." Clara laughed, a full, unrestrained sound that Jedediah realized, with a sudden jolt, he had rarely heard from her. "That sounds exactly like Ellie, always trying to get me to live a little," as she put it. They walked toward the cabin together, and Jedediah was acutely, delightfully aware of the comfortable silence that settled between them, of how utterly natural it felt to have Clara walking beside him under the vast, star-studded canopy of the western sky. It was a dangerous feeling, he knew, one that brought equal measures of profound comfort and unsettling guilt. The following weeks brought subtle, yet profound changes to the homestead and to the tentative, blossoming friendship between Jedediah and Clara. As June gracefully gave way to July, the vegetable garden, a testament to Clara's meticulous care, flourished with an abundance of produce, far more than the two of them could possibly consume. Clara, with her innate practicality, suggested they preserve the excess. Soon, the cabin was filled with the sweet-sour, comforting smell of pickling cucumbers and the fruity, fragrant steam of jam-making, a symphony of domesticity. Jedediah found himself increasingly drawn to the domestic scenes he would discover upon returning from his demanding work in the fields or with the livestock. Clara, with a dusting of flour on her cheek, diligently kneading bread dough, her movements strong and rhythmic. Clara, on her knees in the sun-drenched garden, her hat askew, carefully harvesting plump beans. Clara, sitting peacefully on the porch in the soft evening light, mending one of his shirts with the same precise, loving stitches Ilara had always used. These simple, everyday images brought a complex, bittersweet mixture of emotions. Profound gratitude for the loving care she bestowed upon his home, a twinge of guilt at the unexpected pleasure he found in her quiet, steady company, and an increasing, undeniable dread of the day she would inevitably leave it all behind. He began to actively look for reasons to be in her presence, offering to help with tasks he would normally have left entirely to her, suggesting evening walks to check on the progress of the apple saplings, or to collect the sweet wild berries that grew abundantly on the hillside. For her part, Clara seemed to be shedding more of her Eastern reserve, her careful composure, with each passing day. She laughed more freely, her voice ringing with genuine amusement, spoke more openly and candidly of her thoughts and feelings, revealing a hidden depth. She even, to Jedediah's quiet amusement, adopted some of the practical, no-nonsense frontier habits she had initially viewed with polite skepticism. Jedediah once caught her, early one morning, drinking strong coffee directly from the pot when she thought he wasn't looking, a distinctly unladylike act. The sheepish, charming grin she gave him when discovered was so utterly disarming that he couldn't help but laugh, a deep, heartfelt sound. Ilara would never believe it, he teased gently, his eyes twinkling. Her proper sister, drinking cowboy coffee straight from the pot. Ilara knew me better than you think, Jedediah Stone, Clara retorted, a playful spark in her emerald eyes. Who do you think taught me to ride astride rather than side saddle when no one was looking? This casual mention of Ilara, once a source of sharp, agonizing pain, no longer brought the same visceral ache. Instead, Jedediah found a strange, comforting solace in these shared memories, in the quiet knowledge that through Clara, Ilara's vibrant spirit somehow remained present, a gentle echo in their daily lives. It was during one of their leisurely evening walks, as they checked on the promising progress of the young apple saplings, that the delicate, unspoken balance between them first subtly shifted, a barely perceptible tremor beneath the surface. They had been engrossed in a discussion about the exciting possibility of expanding the orchard the following year, when a sudden, fierce summer thunderstorm blew in with unexpected ferocity, catching them entirely off guard. Within moments, they were thoroughly drenched, laughing with unrestrained delight as they ran, soaked to the bone, for the meager shelter of the cabin. Inside, dripping water onto the wooden floorboards, Clara's carefully maintained composure finally broke completely. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, her wet auburn hair hanging in heavy golden ropes around her shoulders, her practical dress clinging to her in a way that made Jedediah suddenly uncomfortably aware of her as a woman rather than simply as Ilara's sister. "Your face when that first raindrop hit," she gasped between peals of laughter, holding her sides. "I've never seen anyone look so personally offended by the weather." Jedediah couldn't help but join in her infectious mirth, even as he tried, with limited success, to subtly avert his eyes from the distinct outline of her figure beneath the sodden fabric. "It was the principle of the thing," he protested good-naturedly, running a hand through his own soaking wet hair. "That cloud deliberately waited until we were at the farthest point from any shelter." Clara's laughter gradually subsided into soft hiccups, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a practical gesture. "We should change before we catch a cold," she said, her voice regaining its practical tone, though her eyes still danced with lingering amusement. "I'll stoke the fire while you fetch some towels." Jedediah nodded, grateful for the chance to compose himself, to regain some semblance of control over his racing thoughts and heart. When he returned with an armful of fluffy towels, Clara had indeed built up the fire, coaxing it into a cheerful, crackling blaze, and was standing before it, gracefully attempting to wring excess water from her sodden skirts. The firelight caught in her wet hair, turning it to a shimmering liquid gold, and Jedediah was struck by how utterly beautiful she was in that moment. Not in the soft, sunny way Alara had been beautiful, but with a different, perhaps even more potent kind of loveliness, one of quiet strength, luminous clarity, and an undeniable, understated elegance. He must have made some faint sound, for she turned, catching him openly watching her. Something profound passed between them in that suspended moment, a recognition, perhaps, of the irrevocably changing nature of their relationship, a silent acknowledgement of a burgeoning connection. For a long, significant moment, neither spoke, the air thick with unspoken emotions. "Here," Jedediah finally said, his voice a little rough, offering her a towel. "You're shivering." Clara accepted it with a murmured thanks, their fingers brushing lightly in the exchange. The contact, slight and fleeting as it was, sent an unexpected electric jolt through Jedediah, a sudden, powerful reminder of how long it had been since he had experienced even such casual, innocent touch. I should change," he said awkwardly, retreating hastily to his bedroom, needing a moment to collect his scattered thoughts. When he emerged a short while later, comfortably dressed in dry clothes, Clara had also changed. She was now calmly preparing a pot of warm tea, the comforting aroma filling the small cabin. She had braided her damp hair into a neat, practical plait, and the simple, domestic image she presented made Jedediah's heart ache with a confusing, potent mixture of longing and an unsettling, familiar guilt. "I thought tea might warm us up," she said, her voice carefully normal, as if the charged, intimate moment by the roaring fire had never, in fact, happened. "Thank you," Jedediah replied, equally careful, mirroring her practiced composure. "That sounds perfect." They sipped their tea in relative silence, each seemingly lost in their own thoughts, the unspoken tension still lingering in the air. It was Clara who finally broke the quiet, her voice soft but imbued with a new, quiet determination. "Jedediah, I think we need to discuss my departure. It's less than a month away now." Jedediah nodded, his chest tightening with a familiar sense of dread. "Of course. You'll need transportation to Denver to catch the eastbound train." "Yes, but that's not entirely what I meant," Clara said, setting down her cup with a gentle clink and looking at him directly, her emerald eyes unwavering. "We need to ensure you're adequately prepared for winter. The garden will need harvesting and meticulous preserving. The livestock will require thorough preparations for the brutal cold weather, and—" She hesitated, her gaze softening with concern. "And you'll be alone again." The simple, stark statement hung heavy between them, laden with profound implications neither was quite ready to fully voice. "I managed before," Jedediah said, more gruffly than he intended, a defensive edge to his voice. "Did you, Jedediah?" Clara asked gently, her voice full of empathy, not judgment. "When I arrived, you were barely surviving, Jedediah. I don't say that as a criticism. Grief does that to a person. It shatters them. But I worry profoundly about leaving you to face another harsh winter alone, especially with all these stark reminders of Alara, of what you've lost." Jedediah stared unseeingly into his tea, unable to meet her steady, compassionate gaze. "What would you have me do, Clara? Sell the place? Move back east?" "No," Clara said firmly, her voice resolute. "This is your home, Jedediah. You and Alara built it together. brick by brick, dream by dream, and her spirit is undeniably here, interwoven into its very fabric. She took a deep, fortifying breath, preparing herself for the difficult words to come. But perhaps you should consider hiring help, or perhaps finding someone to share your life again, Jedediah. To truly share it. Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers in genuine shock, a flicker of outrage in their depths. Clara, Elara has been gone barely 6 months. How can you possibly suggest? Because I knew my sister, Jedediah, Clara interrupted, her voice steady and unwavering, despite the faint flush rising in her cheeks. Elara loved life too much to ever want anyone to stop living it on her account. She wouldn't want you to be alone forever, Jedediah. Not ever. The words struck him with the force of physical blows, not because they were cruel or thoughtless, but because they rang with such undeniable, brutal truth. Elara had been vibrant, passionately alive, always advocating for living life to its absolute fullest. How many times had she gently chided him for his excessive caution, for always putting off joy in favor of dreary practicality. "It's too soon," he said finally, his voice rough with raw emotion, a plea for understanding. "Perhaps," Clara conceded, her voice softer now, tinged with a deep understanding. "But time passes differently here than in the city, Jedediah. Life and death are closer to the surface, more intimately intertwined." Elara understood that deeply. She reached across the rough-hewn table, briefly, tenderly touching his hand. "I'm not suggesting anything improper, Jedediah. I'm simply asking you to consider your future, to truly consider it." The touch of her fingers, warm and reassuring, lingered on his skin, long after she gently withdrew them. "I'll think on it," he promised, though he had absolutely no idea what such profound thinking might possibly entail. That night, lying wide awake in the suffocating darkness of his room, Jedediah found himself finally confronting a torrent of feelings he had been diligently, desperately avoiding for weeks, for months. Clara had come to mean so much more to him than merely his late wife's sister or a temporary, efficient helper. Her quiet, steady presence had, undeniably, brought life back to the homestead, coaxing it from the brink of despair. And, he had to honestly admit, she had brought life back to him. The raw, terrifying thought of her leaving now filled him with a dread that went far beyond mere practical concerns about managing the homestead alone. Yet, the very idea of developing deeper, romantic feelings for her felt like an unforgivable betrayal of Elara's cherished memory. How could he possibly care for her sister when Elara had been gone such a tragically short time? What kind of man would that make him? Sleep utterly eluded him as he wrestled fiercely with these agonizing questions, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and longing. And when dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky with soft, hopeful hues, he rose early, before the sun was fully up, and rode out to the farthest, most secluded pasture, desperately seeking solitude, a quiet space to clear his troubled thoughts. It was there, sitting alone on a fallen log, overlooking the vast, silent valley stretching out below, that Jedediah finally allowed himself to imagine a future utterly different from the one he had always expected, the one he had built with Elara. What if Clara didn't return to Boston, to her old life? What if she stayed? Not merely as his sister-in-law and efficient helper, but as something more, something profoundly different. The thought both terrified and exhilarating him in equal measure. It would mean acknowledging, truly acknowledging, that life continued, that love, against all odds, could bloom again, even from the harsh, seemingly barren soil of profound grief. It would mean risking his heart when he had truly believed it permanently shattered, irrevocably broken by Alara's death. And what of Clara herself? She had given absolutely no clear indication that she harbored any feelings for him beyond friendship, beyond family obligation. She had her own vibrant life in bustling Boston, a respectable, fulfilling position, cherished colleagues, bright, dependent students. What, he wondered desperately, could he possibly offer to truly compete with that security, that established life? Jedediah returned to the cabin late that afternoon, exhausted, but feeling somehow lighter for having finally acknowledged the swirling questions within him, for having dared to face them. He found Clara peacefully sitting on the porch, engrossed in one of Ilara's beloved books, her face serene and beautiful in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. "I was beginning to worry," she said, looking up with a soft, warm smile that made his heart skip a beat. "You were gone a long while." "Had some thinking to do," Jedediah replied, his voice a little gruff but honest, settling into the familiar chair beside her. "About what you said last night." Clara closed her book, carefully marking her place, and gave him her full, undivided attention. And I don't know what the future holds, Clara," Jedediah said honestly, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "But I do know that these past weeks, having you here, have undeniably made this place feel like home again. And I'm profoundly grateful for that, whatever comes next." Something softened subtly in Clara's expression, a deep understanding. "I'm glad," she said simply, her voice a gentle balm. "That's all Ilara would have truly wanted for you." The mention of Ilara, which had once been a source of such agonizing pain, no longer created a wall between them, but rather, surprisingly, a bridge of shared love for a remarkable woman who had, in different ways, shaped both their lives. They sat together in companionable silence as the sun slowly slipped behind the majestic mountains, each contemplating possibilities neither was quite ready to fully voice, to commit to. The following days brought a subtle yet undeniable shift in their interactions, a new awareness between them. There was a palpable consciousness of each other that manifested in countless small, intimate ways. Fingers brushing lightly when passing dishes at dinner, glances held a moment longer than strictly necessary, conversations that stretched late into the evening as neither seemed willing to end the day, to break the fragile spell. Jedediah found himself noticing things about Clara he had previously overlooked, blinded by his grief. The graceful, elegant curve of her neck when she bent over her sewing, the quiet, unwavering determination with which she approached even the most challenging tasks, the dry, unexpected wit that emerged most often when she was truly relaxed, truly herself. She was not Ilara, would never be Ilara, but she was extraordinary, undeniably, in her own right. For her part, Clara seemed to be wrestling with her own complex thoughts and emotions. Jedediah occasionally caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, something between confusion, longing, and a quiet, contemplative sadness. She became alternately more open and more reserved, sometimes speaking freely and candidly of her feelings about the homestead and her time there. Other times, retreating into a formal politeness that reminded him, with a pang, of her first hesitant days with them. The catalyst for their next step came in the form of a crisp, official letter from Boston, delivered by a passing neighbor who had collected the mail from town. Clara read it in silence at the breakfast table, her expression growing increasingly troubled with each line. "Bad news?" Jedediah ventured, his voice carefully neutral, when she finally set the letter aside with a sigh. Not exactly, Clara replied, absently stirring her now cooling coffee, her gaze distant. The school board is asking for confirmation of my return date. They're making arrangements for the fall term. Jedediah nodded, trying desperately to ignore the heavy, sinking feeling in his stomach, the tightening in his chest. I suppose they need to plan ahead. Yes. Clara's gaze remained distant, thoughtful. I should respond promptly. They've been very accommodating about my extended absence. Of course, Jedediah agreed, though each word felt like a heavy stone in his throat, threatening to choke him. When would you need to leave to arrive in time? The second week of August at the latest, Clara said, finally meeting his eyes directly, her emerald gaze serious. Just over 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks. The short, stark time frame hung heavy between them, suddenly making all their unspoken questions, all their hidden longings, urgent and painfully immediate. Jedediah wanted desperately to ask her to stay, to pour out his heart and tell her how much she had come to mean to him, how indispensable she had become. But the words, trapped by fear and uncertainty, stuck firmly in his throat. What right did he truly have to disrupt her life, to ask her to abandon a respectable, fulfilling career for the uncertainties, the undeniable hardships of frontier life with a widower still undeniably haunted by his late wife's memory? "I'll arrange transportation to Denver," he said instead, rising abruptly from the table, needing to escape the suffocating closeness. "Excuse me, I need to check on the north pasture fence." He spent the rest of the day working harder than necessary, driving himself to the point of utter exhaustion in a desperate attempt to quiet his troubled, racing thoughts. When he returned to the cabin that evening, sweaty and sore, his muscles aching, he found Clara sitting at Alara's old writing desk, several sheets of paper covered in her neat, precise handwriting spread before her. "I've made a list," she said without preamble as he entered, her voice calm and businesslike, "of everything that will need attention after I leave. The garden harvest, winter preparations, preserves that should be made." She handed him the papers, her expression determinedly practical, carefully controlled. "I've tried to be thorough." Jedediah glanced at the meticulously detailed pages, instructions for countless tasks he should have known how to manage, but had surrendered to grief and neglect. The profound care, the quiet love evident in each precise note, made his chest ache with a complex mixture of gratitude and renewed sorrow. "This is very thoughtful," he said, his words inadequate, failing to truly convey the depth of his feelings. "I want to make sure you'll be all right," Clara replied, her voice carefully controlled, betraying no emotion. Alara would expect nothing less. The mention of his late wife, which had slowly, gradually, become a source of comfort rather than raw pain, now felt like an insurmountable barrier between them. Alara, her cherished memory, her unspoken wishes, her enduring legacy, seemed to overshadow every interaction, making it impossible for either of them to speak plainly, honestly, of their own burgeoning feelings. "Clara," Jedediah began, then faltered, utterly unsure what he could possibly say that would bridge the vast, emotional gap between them. She waited patiently, her beautiful emerald eyes searching his face, a silent invitation to speak his truth. But when he remained silent, unable to articulate his jumbled thoughts, something like profound resignation crossed her features. "I should finish packing my trunk," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. "There's so much to organize before I leave." Jedediah nodded, stepping aside to let her pass, his heart heavy. As she moved toward her room, he noticed, truly noticed for the first time, how she had transformed it from the spare, utilitarian space it had been into something that subtly, gently reflected her quiet, steady presence. Wildflowers in a small jar on the windowsill, books stacked neatly on the small bedside table, a quilt she had meticulously mended, draped across the foot of the bed. Soon, he realized with a sickening lurch, all traces of her would be gone, as if she had never been there at all. The thought was unbearable, a crushing weight in his chest. "Don't go," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could even consider them, raw and desperate. Clara froze, her back to him, her hand resting gently on the doorframe. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely audible, a fragile whisper. Jedediah took a deep, fortifying breath, committing himself fully to a path he had barely dared to contemplate, a future he had only glimpsed in his wildest dreams. "I'm asking you to stay, Clara, not just for the harvest or for winter preparations, but permanently." She turned slowly, her expression guarded, her eyes searching his. "As what, Jedediah? Your housekeeper? Your sister-in-law?" The directness of her question left absolutely no room for evasion, no space for ambiguity. Jedediah crossed the room in 2 long strides, coming to stand directly before her, close enough to see the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat, a frantic bird beneath her skin. "As my wife," he said simply, the words ringing with a profound, terrifying sincerity. "If you could ever consider such a thing." Clara's eyes widened, a deep flush spreading rapidly across her cheeks, a blush of surprise, and perhaps something more. "Jedediah, we barely know each other, and Alara—" "I loved Alara," Jedediah interrupted gently, his voice soft but firm, a clear distinction in his tone. "I will always love her. But she's gone. And in these past months, you've helped me see that life, against all odds, continues. That I can continue." He reached for her hand, half expecting her to pull away, to recoil, but she allowed him to take it, her fingers trembling slightly in his. "I'm not asking you to replace her, Clara. No one ever could. I'm asking if you might consider building something new with me, something entirely ours." Clara looked down at their joined hands, her expression troubled, a storm of emotions swirling in her emerald eyes. "I came here out of duty to my sister, to help you through your grief. I never expected—" She trailed off, seemingly unable to put her complex feelings into coherent words. "Nor did I," Jedediah admitted, his voice raw with a newfound vulnerability. "But here we are. Well, I've come to care for you, Clara, deeply, and I hope, you might feel something for me as well." She raised her eyes to his, and the raw vulnerability he saw there made his heart contract, a painful squeeze. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And it terrifies me. It feels like a betrayal of Alara, like I've somehow taken advantage of her death to—" "No," Jedediah said firmly, cutting her off, his voice resolute. "Alara loved us both, Clara. She would understand how grief and healing can lead to unexpected, beautiful places." He squeezed her hand gently, a silent reassurance. "Remember what you told me, that Alara wouldn't want anyone to stop living on her account." A small, sad smile, poignant and bittersweet, touched Clara's lips. "Using my own words against me, Mr. Stone?" "Only because they were wise words, Miss Beaumont," Jedediah replied, a hint of his old humor returning. Clara withdrew her hand from his, but not in rejection. Rather, she seemed to need space, a moment of profound solitude to think, to process the momentous, life-altering conversation they were having. Even if we set aside concerns about Elara, she said carefully, her voice measured, there are practical considerations. My position in Boston, the profound difference in our lives and experiences, the undeniable challenges of frontier life. All true, Jedediah acknowledged, his voice steady. I'm not asking for an answer this very moment, Clara. Only that you consider the possibility that you don't leave without us discussing what might truly be between us. Clara studied his face intently, as if searching for any hint of doubt or deception. Finding neither, she nodded slowly, a quiet surrender. I need time to think, she said, her voice soft but firm. This is unexpected. Of course, Jedediah agreed, stepping back to give her the physical space that matched the vast, emotional space she clearly needed. Take all the time you need. Clara retreated to her room then, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Jedediah alone in the main room of the cabin. He stood there, feeling both lighter for having finally spoken his heart, for having laid his soul bare, and intensely anxious about what her answer might ultimately be. He had laid his heart bare. Now he could only wait and hope with every fiber of his being. The next day brought a tense return to their normal, familiar routines, though an undeniable undercurrent of strained tension ran beneath every single interaction. Clara was quieter than usual, clearly deep in thought, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Jedediah found himself alternating wildly between exhilarating hope and crushing despair. Had he spoken too soon? Had he utterly misread her feelings, her subtle signals? Was he, in pursuing happiness with her sister, somehow dishonoring Elara's cherished memory? By evening, the atmosphere in the cabin had grown so thick, so strained, that Jedediah tentatively suggested he sleep in the barn to give Clara more privacy, more space to think. Her response, however, surprised him. No, she said firmly, her voice resolute. We need to talk about this, Jedediah. Running away won't help either of us. They sat at the familiar kitchen table, a steaming pot of tea between them, like adversaries at a critical negotiation, rather than two people contemplating a shared life together. Clara's hands were steady as she poured the tea, her movements precise. But Jedediah noted the slight, telltale crease between her brows that appeared only when she was deeply, profoundly concerned. I've been thinking all day, she began, handing him a warm cup, her voice calm and measured, revealing little, about your proposal, about Elara, about what life might be like if I stayed. Jedediah nodded, not trusting himself to speak, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. I care for you, Jedediah, Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, conviction. More than I ever expected to, more than is perhaps proper, given the unique circumstances. But I can't help what I feel. Hope flared wildly in Jedediah's chest, a sudden bright burst of light. But he tempered it, reining it in, sensing there was more to come, another caveat. However, Clara said, meeting his gaze directly, her emerald eyes unwavering, I won't be a replacement for Elara. I won't live in her shadow, or be constantly compared to her at every turn. If I were to stay, if I were to consider becoming your wife, it would have to be for who I am, Jedediah, not for who she was. The firmness, the absolute resolve in her voice, left no room for negotiation, no space for compromise. And Jedediah realized, with sudden, profound clarity, that this was the absolute heart of the matter. Clara feared being forever measured against her beloved sister, and ultimately, inevitably, found wanting. I would never ask that of you, he said sincerely, his voice thick with emotion. You're not Elara. You're Clara, with your own unique strengths, your own individual ways, your own beautiful heart. That's who I've come to care for, deeply. Some of the tension visibly left her shoulders at his heartfelt words, a subtle relaxation of her guarded posture. "And the homestead?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Would you expect me to manage it exactly as she did?" Jedediah shook his head, a gentle smile touching his lips. "The homestead would be ours, Clara, to shape together, to shape. You've already made changes that work better than what we had before, the intelligent way you organized the root cellar, how you cleverly rearranged the kitchen." He smiled slightly, a hint of genuine amusement in his eyes. Elara would have approved, by the way. She always said her system was organized chaos. A ghost of a smile, fleeting yet genuine, touched Clara's lips at that. "She wrote as much in her letters," she admitted, a nostalgic fondness in her voice. "Said you could never find anything when she was done organizing." The shared memory, so simple yet so profound, created a precious moment of connection, and Jedediah, sensing its power, seized it. "That's just it, Clara. Elara will always be a part of our lives, a part of our memories. In the things she taught us both, in the strong foundation she helped build here. But our future, should we choose to bravely share one, would be entirely our own to create." Together. Clara was silent for a long, contemplative moment, her gaze fixed, unseeing, on her tea. When she finally looked up, there was a new, quiet resolve shining brightly in her emerald eyes. "I need to visit her grave," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Alone, before I can give you an answer, Jedediah." Jedediah nodded, understanding instinctively, deeply. "Of course. Take all the time you need, Clara." The next morning dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of soft, golden light that made the mountain valley appear almost otherworldly, magical. Jedediah watched from the porch as Clara made her way slowly up the gentle slope to Elara's grave. A small, vibrant bunch of wildflowers clutched gently in her hand. She was wearing her blue dress, the same one she had worn to the social, and had pinned her auburn hair in the simpler, more practical style she had adopted during her time at the homestead. He tried diligently not to speculate about what profound thoughts might be passing through her mind as she knelt beside her sister's grave. Was she asking for forgiveness? Seeking a final blessing? Or simply, quietly, saying goodbye? Whatever communion she sought with Elara's memory was deeply private, sacred in a way he could not, dared not, intrude upon. Jedediah busied himself with mundane chores, though his mind remained irrevocably fixed on the woman on the hillside, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. After what seemed both an eternity and no time at all, he saw Clara slowly rising, placing the wildflowers gently at the base of the weathered wooden cross, and then standing motionless for several minutes, her face turned serenely toward the expansive valley below. When she finally returned to the cabin, her expression was calm, serene, her eyes clear and resolute, all traces of doubt seemingly vanished. Jedediah set aside the harness he had been meticulously mending and stood to meet her, his heart pounding with a mixture of intense anticipation and raw fear. "I've made my decision," Clara said simply, her voice clear and steady. Jedediah nodded, utterly unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. "I will stay," she said, her voice gaining strength, conviction. "I will marry you, Jedediah, not because you were Elara's husband, or because I feel obligated to help you, but because I have found something here I never expected, something truly precious." She took a deep, fortifying breath, her eyes shining. "I've found a home, and I've found feelings for you that I cannot, do not wish to, deny." Joy surged through Jedediah, so powerful, so overwhelming, that it left him momentarily speechless, breathless. When he could finally form words, they were utterly inadequate to express the tumultuous emotions flooding through him, the profound relief, the exhilarating hope. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I thank you. I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy, for all our days." A radiant smile broke across her face then, not the reserved, careful smile he had grown accustomed to, but something dazzling, utterly unguarded, a reflection of pure happiness. "I believe you will," she said, her voice soft with absolute trust. "And I will do the same for you, Jedediah, with all my heart." Jedediah closed the small distance between them, taking her hands gently in his thumbs stroking the backs of her knuckles. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly, suddenly shy despite the momentous decision they had just made, a delicate query. Clara's smile turned gentle, exquisitely tender. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I would like that very much, Jedediah." Their first kiss, as a truly committed couple, was tentative, a gentle meeting of lips that spoke more of profound promise than raw passion. Yet even in its restraint, in its quiet tenderness, Jedediah felt something awaken deep within him that had been dormant since Ilara's death. A renewed capacity for joy, for deep connection, for a future happiness he had thought forever lost. As they gently drew apart, he saw in Clara's shining emerald eyes a clear reflection of his own complex emotions. Hope, vibrant and new, mingled with a faint touch of sadness for the difficult, winding path that had ultimately led them here, to this unexpected, beautiful beginning. "I should write to the school," Clara said pragmatically, though her voice was noticeably softer than usual, tinged with a new lightness. "They'll need to find a replacement before the term begins." Jedediah nodded reluctantly, gently releasing her hands, a tender possessiveness lingering. "And we should speak to Reverend Johnson about the wedding." "Yes," Clara agreed, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Though perhaps we should wait a respectful period, for appearance's sake, if nothing else." Jedediah considered this. A part of him yearned to claim Clara as his wife immediately, to solidify their commitment, their shared future, before anything could possibly change her mind. Yet he understood her deep concern for propriety, for the feelings of the tight-knit community who had watched him mourn Ilara, and who would now witness this new, unexpected union. "Until autumn then," he suggested, a compromise. "After the harvest is fully brought in." Clara nodded, seemingly pleased with the thoughtful compromise. "That would be appropriate, Jedediah. It gives us time to be certain, to truly settle, and it honors Ilara's memory in a respectful way." The mention of Ilara no longer brought a sharp sting of pain, but rather a shared understanding of the unusual yet beautiful circumstances that had brought them together. "She would approve, I think," Jedediah said quietly, his gaze fixed on Clara's face, "of us finding happiness together." "Yes," Clara agreed, her eyes soft with the gentle haze of memory. "When we were girls, she always said I was too serious, too focused on duty. She would tell me, 'See, someday you'll need to follow your heart instead of your head.' I think this is what she meant." Jedediah smiled, touched by this intimate glimpse into the sisters' unique relationship. "She called you C?" "Only when she was teasing me," Clara admitted with a small self-deprecating laugh. "She knew I preferred my full name." "And do you still prefer it? I mean, Clara?" Clara considered the question with surprising seriousness, a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. "I've always been Clara. Proper, precise Clara. But perhaps here, in this new life, in this wild, untamed place." She smiled up at him, a radiant, unguarded smile. "Perhaps I could be C, at least sometimes. Jedediah felt the profound significance of this small, seemingly insignificant concession, a deep willingness to grow into a new version of herself, to embrace a new identity, just as he was slowly, tentatively, growing beyond the grief-stricken widower she had first encountered. "I think you can be whoever you choose to be here," he said, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "That's the true gift of the frontier, the chance to redefine yourself, to become who you were always meant to be." The days that followed were filled with a new, exhilarating sense of purpose and, increasingly, with an undeniable, overflowing joy. Clara diligently wrote to the school board, explaining her heartfelt decision to remain in Colorado and thoughtfully recommending a suitable replacement from among her esteemed colleagues. Jedediah rode into town to speak with Reverend Johnson, a kind and understanding man who readily agreed to perform the ceremony in late September, after the primary harvest was fully complete, ensuring all was in order. The news of their unexpected engagement spread quickly, like wildfire, through the small, tightly knit community. Jedediah had braced himself for disapproval, for hushed whispers about the impropriety of marrying his late wife's sister so soon after her death. But to his profound surprise, the response was largely positive, even warmly supportive. The women of Pinecrest in particular seemed to view the arrangement as both eminently practical and deeply touching, a sensible, compassionate way of honoring Ilara's memory, while simultaneously ensuring the vital future of the homestead she had loved, preserving her legacy. "Makes perfect sense," Mrs. Miller declared, a knowing twinkle in her eye, when they announced their plans at Sunday services. Who better to truly understand your loss than her own sister? And who better to continue Ilara's good work here? Clara handled these comments with remarkable grace, neither fully confirming the practical interpretation of their burgeoning relationship, nor, crucially, revealing the deeper, more profound feelings that had so unexpectedly blossomed between them. In private, however, she and Jedediah continued to intimately explore those feelings, diligently learning each other's histories, discovering their unique preferences, and gently sharing their deepest dreams in a way their tumultuous circumstances had not previously allowed. Jedediah discovered that beneath Clara's reserved, almost formal exterior lay a woman of incredibly strong opinions and surprising, fiery passion. She could debate politics with the fervor of a seasoned campaigner, had firm, well-thought-out ideas about how the homestead should be meticulously run, and revealed a mischievous, playful streak that emerged most often when they were comfortably alone together. For her part, Clara uncovered unexpected layers to Jedediah that Ilara's letters, with all their loving detail, had never fully conveyed. His dry, understated humor, his profound, almost spiritual connection to the untamed land, the remarkable depth of thought that his taciturn nature often concealed. She came to understand that the flinty, taciturn mask Jedediah wore to the world was only weathered leather over a gentler core. The man who could drop a steer with a single shot also stopped to right a toppled bird's nest, who mended a cracked fence rail with the same patient care he used to press a sprig of wild lupine between Ilara's old pages, so Clara would have spring in winter. He quoted scripture sparingly, and Emerson unexpectedly. He could be stubborn as a mule, and then, without fanfare, yield the last cup of coffee, because she liked it hot, not scorched from the bottom of the pot. In these small mercies, Clara found the shape of a future she had never dared to sketch. News of their engagement traveled faster than the stage. It ran the ridgelines and dropped into the schoolyard and stores, and the verdict in Pinecrest, so far as human hearts ever get a verdict, was kindly. Reverend Johnson penciled the ceremony for the last Saturday of September, after the bulk of the harvest, when the aspens went to coins and the wind forgot itself long enough to bless a wedding. Clara wrote to Boston with a steady hand. She recommended Miss Whitaker to take her classes and folded away the last life she'd known into a letter sealed with wax. They worked as the sky turned honey and the days shortened, side by side with a rhythm that felt like prayer. They lifted crock after crock onto the cool earth of the cellar, lined shelves with jars that caught the afternoon light. Peach and chokecherry, cucumber and bean, small suns to swallow in January. They gathered the first tiny apples, not to eat, but to cradle and dream over, proof that what you plant in sorrow can root to joy. On quiet evenings, when fatigue softened speech and made laughter easily found, they spoke of the house they would make of the house they already had. A second shelf by the window for Clara's books, a peg beside the door for the shawl she favored, a cradle one day, when God consented. The morning of their wedding rose clear and cool, a thin rime of frost silvering the pump handle. Jedediah shaved close and ran a thumb along the jawline of a stranger he half recognized. He dressed in a black coat that fit a little too tightly across the shoulders, honest evidence of a summer's work, and a new shirt stiff enough to creak. He fixed a sprig of sage at his lapel because Ilara had loved its clean smell, and because Clara said it looked fine. In the yard, neighbors set out boards across sawhorses and covered them with linen and pies. Silas tuned his fiddle. Mrs. Miller, who never cried at anything but weddings and colicky babies, tucked a square of lawn to her sleeve and pretended not to. Clara stepped out of the cabin on Jacob Miller's arm, wearing a dress the soft blue of shadowed ice and a crown of aspen leaves and field daisies Mrs. Miller had twisted with careful hands. She carried no veil, there was nothing to hide, and when she reached the arbor Jedediah had hammered together from peeled saplings, she looked straight at him. Whatever had been unsettled in Jedediah stilled. The valley opened behind her like a benediction, and for one long heartbeat, even the wind listened. Reverend Johnson's words were simple. They did not try to out-talk a mountain. They promised what could be promised and spared what could not be known. When he asked who gave the woman, Jacob said, "Her good sense," and handed her a cross with a grin. Jedediah slipped a plain ring onto Clara's finger, a band purchased in Denver at the price of 3 steers and the longest day he could remember, and felt it bite his knuckle, a circle that said, "Stay." Clara's voice did not shake when she answered. It only dropped once when she said Jedediah's name, as if his name had weight. They kissed, and Pinecrest cheered. The fiddle leaped to a reel, and the tables bowed under the burden of hospitality. Someone passed a bottle, someone else passed a baby. They danced until the light went thin and the east turned the color of a banked fire. Once, during the clapping and laughter, Clara's gaze drifted to the gentle swell of hillside where a wooden cross watched over the valley. Her eyes did not cloud, they brightened. "Tomorrow," she said when Jedediah followed her glance, and he knew her meaning. They went the next afternoon with a jar of chokecherry jam, because Ilara had been partial to its tart, and the last of the bread still warm. They sat on the grass, where the season had glazed the tips with gold. They told Ilara what they had done, and what they meant to do, where the apple row would run, how the roof wanted re-shingling come spring, that the rooster had turned a tyrant and must be taught humility, that some days hurt and all days held. Jedediah's hand found Clara's as naturally as a creek finds lower ground. When they rose, a hawk wheeled once overhead and slid down the face of the afternoon into the far blue. It felt to them like consent. Winter did not ask permission. It came iron-hard and early. The snow stacked to the windowsills and then higher, heavy as stone. The pump froze twice and the second time broke clean, and Jedediah worked a new handle by lamplight, heat burning in the small of his back. Some mornings, Clara had to light 2 fires before the kettle would hum. Some nights, the wind made the cabin shiver like a living thing, and Jedediah woke and put his palm to the wall as if to steady it and perhaps to steady himself. They learned to speak in small comforts, a second log, the good blanket, an extra spoon of beans, a story told in the late hour. It was in that tight season that their marriage settled deep below frost line. They quarreled once, properly, when Jedediah took the sleigh alone across the ridge to fetch a sack of flour and returned at dusk with a split lip and a tale about a drift that had swallowed him up to his chest. Clara spoke low and even. Low and even is where anger lives when it is afraid. And then she washed his face and said she'd rather eat cornmeal forever than set a place for a man who thought himself invincible. He held his hat in both hands like a boy and said he was sorry, and the word, humble and whole, warmed the room better than the stove. By February, the cellar shelves had thinned to modest wealth. They counted jars like misers and ate them like kings. On a Sunday at the turn of March, when the snow softened and slid from the roof in sighs and the distant creek began to talk again, Clara took Jedediah's hand and placed it low on her belly, still as flat as a field before seed. "I think," she said, voice near to laughter and tears, "we have a promise growing." Jedediah felt nothing but the heat of her through wool and cotton, and yet felt everything, his own pulse racing the one that would be, the smallness and vastness of what a single life can hold. He kissed the place, and then her mouth, and then the heel of her hand, and did not care if the world counted him foolish for it. Spring came on like forgiveness. The aspens shook out new coins. The garden returned from its sleep, row by row, under Clara's firm hand. The apple trees threw tentative leaves, and Jedediah tied soft rags to their slender trunks so the calves wouldn't nibble them down to hope. Clara worked until work became a slow rock of breath, and then sat to rest, and pressed a palm to the life within, and began, shyly at first, to hum. Jedediah caught her once, staring at the cradle he'd planed smooth, her face open as a girl's, and he put a blanket across her knees without a word. Summer arrived, wreathed in bees and heat mirages. The homestead grew heavy with abundance. Neighbors stopped more often, and there was always coffee, and if there wasn't, there was always reason to make some. The talk turned to names, as talk will, to whether a child born to high country air comes out loud or quiet, and to whether the child would take to books, as its mother hoped, or to saddles, as its father pretended not to hope. Once, at twilight, Clara said, "I think of Elara," and Jedediah said, "Me too." And between them, the thought ceased to be a sorrow and became a circle. The baby chose a night stitched with snow, as if she meant to belong to every season at once. The wind laid a white hand on the valley. Mrs. Miller came with her bag and competence, and the hurricane lamp threw a soft crown of gold across Clara's damp hair. Time went to pieces and to purpose. Jedediah did as he was told, carried water, stoked the stove, lent his arm, kept his eyes where Clara wanted them, at her face, there, where strength and fear and joy and a kind of holy fury rose and broke and rose again. When the cry came, small and insistent and utterly new, he did not realize he had been holding his breath until his chest hurt from the relief of air. Mrs. Miller laid a little bundle into his arms, grumbling affection at the weight and health of her, and Jedediah looked down into a face the size of his palm and felt the ground under him change. She had Elara's copper in her hair, where it fuzzed like a thistle down, and Clara's steady stare once her eyes learned the trick of it. She fisted his finger and scolded him for being slow to hand her to her mother, which made him laugh in a way that frightened the cat. Clara, spent and radiant, reached for them both. "What shall we call her?" he asked, though he had turned a dozen names over in his mind in the long nights of waiting. Clara brushed the baby's brow with a touch that was almost a prayer. "Eleanor Elara Stone," she said softly. "Eleanor for light. Elara for love we keep." Jedediah repeated it, tasting what it made in his mouth. "Eleanor Ilara," he said, and the room seemed to answer back. He bent and kissed his daughter's forehead. "Welcome home," he whispered. He said it to the child, and to the woman who had brought her, and to the life that had found its way through the wilderness to their door. In the months that followed, there were still hard days. Fences went down in sudden wind. Calves died you'd sworn you'd saved. A late hailstorm chewed the cabbage to lace and left Clara quiet for a long while at the window. But there were also mornings when the valley ran green to the far blue, and the baby laughed at a sunbeam like she'd discovered fire. There were suppers taken on the steps, with the heat going from the day and the shadows long and kind, when Jedediah would point out stars, and Clara would correct him, and he would let her, because he liked the sound of her lecturing better than he liked being right. Sometimes, when the work was done and the child slept, they'd walk up the slope with a lantern and stand where the wooden cross kept its vigil. The light would throw their shadows long across the grass. They would speak low and tell Ilara the things people tell the dead, not because the dead require it, but because the living do. That the orchard had set, that the roof had held, that the baby liked the song about the fox best. Once, as they turned to go, Clara slipped her arm through Jedediah's and rested her head against his shoulder, and he felt the old ache stir and then settle into something that did not bite, but bound. The West remained what it ever was, beautiful, unforgiving, wider than any heart could hold. But their small square of it was tended and stubborn and blessed in the plain ways that matter. Love had not replaced love. It had answered it. Grief had not been argued down. It had been companioned so long it learned to sit quiet. And when the wind went through the aspens and set the leaves to talking, coins chattering on a string, you could almost believe the valley remembered every vow ever spoken under its sky and kept watch over them all.